Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the Mad Mamluks. I'm Mahin, and I'm joined by my co-host Sim. Got a really juicy podcast for y'all today. We welcome Nura Maznavi, who is the co-editor of the books Salaam, Love, and Love Inshallah, 2 books about American Muslim love stories. And to chime in, we decided to bring our wives on. That's right, the wives of TMM. Sim's wife Noreen and my wife Sarah are also guests on this podcast. But first of all, I'd like to welcome Nora to the podcast. And I remember we came across your books like 3 years ago because you had a program at the University of Chicago with your co-editor Aisha Matu, and I think Arif Chaudhry, one of your contributors.
Yeah,
who's like a family friend of ours.
Oh, small world.
And so I remember picking up those books right then. Within a couple of days, I read both of them. I have my favorites. Some of those stories really stuck with me for many years.
Oh, I'm sure they have.
Yeah, so we'll get to that. But
fair warning out there, listeners. Trigger warnings are in effect, and make sure you turn the radio down for your young children or whatever.
Yeah, it's like one of those things where, you know, don't call us or PM us to say you're embarrassed because of the content of this podcast. But anyways, with that being said, Nora, like this subject of American Muslim love stories, why is this something that you wanted to be a part of as far as this project goes?
Okay, so I'm going to start off by saying that if you have children listening to this podcast, they should listen to this podcast. Because one of the reasons we even started these books was because we realized that these are issues that are not being spoken about in the Muslim community openly. And, you know, obviously things have to be age appropriate, but stories of love, matters of the heart, relationships, dating, all these sorts of words that as children we're taught like not to even think about or talk about, they're all relevant. They're relevant to children. They're relevant to young people. And we really wanted to start these conversations amongst friends, amongst family. So that's one of the main reasons that we put these stories together, just to start a conversation. And it's been 5 years since Love Inshallah came out, 3 years since Salaam, Love came out. And I mean, we're so excited that we continue to talk about these books and talk about the stories. And I think they still resonate with people.
What's the reception like so far?
It's really been overwhelmingly positive. So I think when we first conceived of these books, we were really nervous. We thought people are going to freak out. We thought, because you hear about all these like death threats, honestly, it would have been great if we had death threats probably for sales, but we didn't have any. But it was overwhelmingly positive. We did get pushback from people who said these are private stories. You shouldn't talk about these kinds of things openly, cover your sins, which we can talk about later, what I think about that. But for the most part, it's been really positive. People who have said that reading these stories made them feel connected. It made them feel like they weren't alone. It made them feel like they were normal, that these desires and urges and feelings that they had weren't weird or weren't wrong, that it's something that we all feel. So I think a lot of people sort of really connected with the stories and the writers and the collections.
You come from a law background, right?
Yes. So I have been a lawyer for 13 years now, and my background is civil rights work. And that's actually one of the reasons that I thought about this book. Aisha and I was living in San Francisco at the time, and I was working on prisoner rights work. And one of the things that really struck me in that kind of work is that you have these primarily men that I was working with who sort of on paper seem like just sort of lost causes, right? Like these long rap sheets, just sort of terrible circumstances. But when I would start talking to these guys, I was visiting prisons, doing intake, that sort of thing, you realize that everybody has a story. And your feelings towards somebody and your feelings about somebody's circumstances really change when you sort of connect with that person on that kind of level. And I realized that even with Muslims, I mean, sometimes I look at some of these campaigns like Get to Know a Muslim or Muslims, we're all about peace, and you can have these sorts of taglines, but until people connect with each other on sort of this very intimate level, I think there's still a disconnect.
Yeah, I can totally understand where you're coming from in regards to that, because I think what's something that we're trying to do with our podcast here is try to be a true representation of Muslims in America and not just be one-sided that, Islam is peace and we're all holding hands and walking through the rainbow.
Mm-hmm.
It's not really like that. We're a diverse community and we have different thoughts, different opinions, different backgrounds, really a kaleidoscope of different people.
Right. And I would say that that's something that Muslims need to hear too. And that was one of the things that we really worked towards in both of these collections, to have this sort of diversity, the breadth, the range of stories within the Muslim community all shared, because oftentimes I think we practice Islam in sort of silos, right? So I grew up in a predominantly South Asian and Arab Muslim community in Southern California. And growing up, that's what Islam sort of looked like to me. And my husband was born and raised on the south side of Chicago. He's Black, Muslim. His grandparents converted to Islam in the 60s. Like, his experience is very different. So what we tried to do in this book is really collect stories from Muslims that are really like a real range. So different races, ethnicities, ages, religious practice. So people in this book who are Orthodox, cultural, secular, we're not all talking to one another, and I think that conversation is really important.
Yeah, that's something we talked about.
Not to mention sexual orientations, even.
Sexual orientation, yes. So we can talk about that too.
Oh my gosh, Mahin's itching to talk about this.
I actually
he can't wait to get to.
I haven't. I think Sarah read the lesbian story today or yesterday,
Yeah.
so she can comment. I forgot about it.
Let's work towards that. All right.
I just go in dry usually.
We actually have two. We have two stories in both collections written by queer writers.
Okay.
So yeah, we can talk about that.
Cool. So you had mentioned that you felt the need for this type of dialogue to be out there. What about that? Why did you feel that need? Because I'll be honest with you, a year ago or so, or a year and a half ago before this podcast started, I couldn't have imagined myself coming from a conservative background, bringing someone like you on the podcast with just knowing that you put out stories that are supposed to be private stories. It's supposed to be stories that are kept hidden away, and we don't want to publicize our sins, and like you had mentioned earlier. So talk a little bit about that. What was your frame of mind, and why you decided, like, hey, I need to put these stories out there?
So I think within the Muslim community, there is a lot of shame and judgment when we talk about issues of relationships, dating, love, all of these sorts of topics. And it's unfortunate because I think these are all topics that people really think about and want to talk about. And it's sort of one of those things where I've seen it in my own sort of life and communities that it starts to alienate people, right? So if you feel like, young, and we can talk about some of the stories, but if young people are being taught, you can't date, you can't have a boyfriend, you can't have a girlfriend, like basically don't think about all of these things and then you're going to get married, it starts, like a lot of people start questioning themselves, like, what's wrong with me? I'm not supposed to do these things, but I'm still thinking about it. It's something that preoccupies a lot of time. And I think it actually starts to form sort of a barrier. People feel like between themselves and their communities or even their faith, like, what is it about my faith that says that I can't have these natural urges and feelings? So one of the reasons that we really wanted to start talking about that is to sort of bring those conversations to light, because things are happening. I mean, one of the really interesting things about these collections, publicly, we got no support from imams or spiritual leaders, but privately, you should have heard them. They were like, these books are really important. I actually recommend it to people who come to me to talk. I mean, and it was just really, these are real topics
Right.
that people are struggling with. So we wanted to sort of create that space where people can talk about it openly and without shame and without judgment.
Hey, and you know what? What's really missing from our community, I'd say, is like a group therapy type of a setting where you can talk about, not necessarily spill the beans and tell every sin that you did, but people just getting together and finding that, we're struggling with similar situations, similar natural human urges that we're having difficulty with, and we need to consult with each other and share ideas on how they're dealing with these problems. And I feel like when I went through your book, I was even able to resonate with some of the feelings that some of the characters, I would say, in your book, some of the things that they've gone through, I went through in periods of my life. Mm-hmm. So it really broadened my horizon, I guess I'll put it like that. I felt like before reading the book, I had a lot of judgmental attitudes towards it. I'm like, you know what, I think that a book like this might encourage or affirm young Muslims to engage in behavior like that. So I think it did definitely open up my mind.
That is a valid point, though, I think. Like sometimes I know that growing up in Muslim communities, when you see your peers who are Muslim doing things that are maybe inappropriate, it kind of opens the door a little bit. But at the same time, you can't just silence everything. People will find out. But back to your whole point about how when we're growing up, when we're coming of age, and we're dealing with the rhetoric from our parents is like, yeah, girls are bad, boys are bad, just focus on school and then you get married. I'd like to poll the panel here just to see what your experiences were growing, like in your teenage years, whenever y'all came of age, how y'all handled that and what was going through your head. Nora, you want to go first?
Yeah, I actually think I have sort of a unique experience. And one of the things I'd say is this has really, and I have 2 small children right now, and I think about parenting very differently now than I did sort of in the abstract. And so I think about how my parents did it. And so first of all, my parents are immigrants from Sri Lanka. We were raised in a pretty traditional Muslim community in Southern California. But I think what was different from my parents and a lot of my Muslim friends is that my parents they were not raised in a Muslim country. So I think they didn't have a lot of fears that a lot of my friends who they see are Arab, their parents had a lot of fear, right? They were coming from a Muslim country to a non-Muslim country. How do you raise practicing Muslim children in a non-Muslim country? And I think the sort of natural inclination with that is to just sort of grip tightly, right? And to just sort of be afraid, and that manifests itself in curfews and boys are not allowed to call your house and all of these sorts of prohibitions that I think a lot of children naturally rebel against that kind of those kinds of rules. And so my parents, it was much more they were okay with me having guy friends. They were okay with me going out, and that's not dating, but going out with mixed groups of friends. But there was a real focus on sort of Islamic practice and sort of knowing what was appropriate and what was not appropriate. And because of that, I feel like I had a pretty healthy relationship with guys. It was never like there was not a lot of awkwardness, I think, that a lot of my friends had. But I mean, for me, it was keeping my head down, studying. I mean, I didn't get married until 33, which is like, God, my parents almost had a heart attack when I turned 25 and I was still single. And then I think by the time I hit 30, they were like, it's over for her. Like, we have to just let this one go and focus on the younger siblings. But yeah, so that was sort of my experience. But it sort of made me think a lot about how I'm going to raise my children. And it's scary, right? My 2-year-old is in this phase right now where she only wants to wear shorts. And the other day I put her in pants and I came downstairs and I said, Layla, come down. And she came down wearing shorts. And I just had this flash forward to her leaving the house and changing into a mini skirt in the bathroom at school. It was such an overreaction, I was like, oh my God, she changed her clothes. And I was like, she's a toddler. I have to calm down. This is what they do. But it's fear, right? It's fear about what could happen, which I have to keep in check because she's 2.5. But I want to hear from you guys what you're sort of...
Let's hear from Nora.
Yeah.
Yeah, so some of the stories, I mean, I was going to mention that I think most of us are first generation American Muslims here. So I think we all dealt with the immigrant parents who couldn't talk about these things. If you tried to talk to them, I was recently telling my sister, I remember asking my mom, did you ever have feelings when you were a teenager? And she was like, shut up. You don't talk about this stuff. Don't ask me such bad things. You shouldn't even have these kinds of thoughts. So reading this book, I definitely felt like, wow, I can actually relate to people like that have gone through what I went through and had the feelings that I had. And it's okay. Like, we were all American Muslims, first generation, living in this, society, having these confused feelings and thoughts, and we weren't alone. So it definitely helps. It was really cool for me to read that and feel that. But yeah, it was one of the stories. And there was talking about sneaking around. I was like, that was totally us. We were, going to the movies. I think one of the stories was about going to movies, and it would be groups of kids, and I would tell my friends, okay, the guys need to be separated, and the girls, and we were just like 8th graders, like 7th, 8th grade, little kids, and we just wanted to watch a movie. But if my parents saw one boy there, I would have been dead. Yeah. So it was always, the boys knew they needed to hide in a corner, and then my parents would drop me off, and I'd wave, and they'd say goodbye, and then we would all go into, Yeah. But there was so much of that sneaking around that we felt we had to do, and that's really cool that your parents were more open about it. Mm-hmm. Now with our kids, we're
look, I always say this on the podcast. There's no rule to parenting. Every parent has to realize what their child is, and not every child is the same. Just because her parents were okay with it doesn't mean that
it works.
It works for us. Every child
and
is
every
different.
kid is different, right?
You have to realize what their strengths are, how well they hold up to the peer pressure and societal pressures, and how much they can stand their ground before they succumb to all these different type of pressures that are surrounding them.
With my daughter's in high school now, so I'm very open with her. I'm very friendly, and I talked to her about. I'm like, so who do you have a crush on?
I'm sure she loves that,
cute? Right? Yeah. But she appreciates having that. And she says her friends are like, wow, you can talk to your mom about that stuff. Mm-hmm. Like, we can't talk to our mom. And their parents are probably immigrants, whatever. But I make sure I keep that line of communication. I tell her, if you have these feelings, it's very normal and natural to feel these, this way. But to act on it is what's sinful. I was like, just don't act on it. You just need to control it. That's all it is control. And I've shared videos, Islamic lectures about how to interact with the opposite gender and things like that. And she said that that's helped her because she didn't know what her limits were. She goes to public school. Mm-hmm. So she's mixing with boys and girls, all day long. So, they're working on projects or whatever. And she said watching those videos has helped her figure out, keep it straightforward. Don't, make the conversation, carry on about other topics. But yeah, so that's, even though I grew up very liberal, my family was very liberal growing up. Mm-hmm. They were cultural Muslims. So in our culture, we don't talk to boys. In our culture, you don't do this. But I started, practicing as a teenager, about 16, 17, and wanted to give my kids more of an Islamic, base. So trying to kind of find that middle ground of the conservative and the liberal has kind of been our challenge of trying to figure it out with our kids.
So back to when you were telling the story about going to the movies, you were in small town Arkansas, right?
Yes.
So I assume most of your friends are non-Muslims?
Yes. So
they understood that this whole logic of the boys got to stay away. How did they understand that?
I went to a private Christian school from 1st to 10th grade. So they were all Christians. Their values are very similar to Muslims. They understand about a lot of the girls weren't allowed to date. A lot of girls dress conservatively. Some of them don't. Some of them do. They get it because they have a lot of Islamic and Christian values are very similar. If we just take the time to learn about each other, it's very, very much the same. It's not too different. So they thought I was, it was cool. They got it. They weren't allowed to date, so they got it, So
Sure. So Sarah, what about you? When you were coming of age, how did you deal with those thoughts and whatnot?
Yeah, I think my background is a little bit different. I came to the United States. I was 7 years old. So I came from Bangladesh, and I kind of already had a sense of, living in a Muslim majority country, and I saw how people interacted there. And so when I moved to the United States, most of what I was seeing culturally in terms of, mixed gender interaction was kind of foreign to me. So I was able to relate more to, what I had seen back home. Growing up, my parents, I would say, they were a lot, to a degree, we wouldn't talk about certain things, but they were more open, in terms of interaction with other boys, or, of the opposite gender. They were kind of like, yeah, we don't do that.
Yeah.
But they were like, when you're at school, you interact. They were okay with me, having a normal interaction, but in terms of something more like, dating, things like that. And they're like, but when we're out in public, they're like, yeah, you say hello to them. It's okay for you to talk to them, have normal interaction, but not to go out and hang out with boys. And based on what I'd seen growing up, my parents were practicing. So I saw that, there were things they were depriving themselves of, that was okayed by the normal society. And so from an early age, I got the sense, okay, we're different. And I see that in my parents. So, I remember when we first came to the United States, my dad, he took me grocery shopping, and, he had me teaching me how to read the ingredients list on things, that we could eat, couldn't eat. This, I was in the second grade at this point. But so before even the puberty hit, I was already kind of aware of, limitations. Mm-hmm. And so by the time I hit, 13 or 14, I had kind of already realized there were limitations. So I don't think I ever found myself in that situation where it never got to that point where, I didn't have the urge to rebel.
You're a goody two-shoes. I was a rebellious one. I even had we had a system, our friends would call, and then they would call three-way, and then the guy would get on.
Yeah, I remember friends doing that too. This was before when they had that number for time. Do you remember that?
Do what?
There was a number where you could call to get the time.
Oh, yes.
And so you would call that, and then someone would call and call waiting, and then you would get the call and then drop the other call. I had friends who did elaborate things like that. So
yeah.
When did you guys first notice the opposite gender? What grade would you say, or how old were y'all?
Preschool?
Yeah, young.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can tell you every crush I had every grade.
I think I can too. Yeah.
So what about you, Sarah?
I think probably around the fourth grade. How old would I have been at that time? Probably
9 or 10.
10,
Yeah.
10, yeah, 10
Yeah,
or
because
11.
y'all hit puberty a little early, right?
7th grade.
Yeah.
Yeah,
End of
compared to guy. For me, it was always for me growing up, it was like when I was a little kid. We'd always hear about some movie coming out like Basic Instinct. Y'all remember that movie?
Yeah.
With Michael Douglas and Sharon Stone. And then,
I didn't see it, but okay.
I'd have these older friends.
No one did. All right.
Yeah,
Except for
No
mine.
one saw it.
I actually didn't see it until much later. But we had these older friends that would me and my friends. We were 9 or 10 years old. Yeah, Basic Instinct's coming out, and then we didn't even know anything about male female anatomy, to be honest. And as a funny story, my buddy, when we're 9 or 8 or 9, we're still friends, but we're 8 or 9 years old. He's telling me this story how, one of his American friends brought over Total Recall. And there's a scene with there's this crazy scene with Total Recall where there's this alien with 3 breasts, and his mom walks in at that moment
Of
and
course.
just screams,
Yeah.
and this kid just runs out of the house.
Oh my
Yeah.
God.
And so we would hear. So that's the kind of it wasn't really from a arousing point of view. I was interested in that. I was like, that's just cool. That's just
Okay, I was not aroused in preschool, okay? Jeez. Okay, if you're talking about noticing boys oh, he's cute,
Yeah.
I want to get with that or whatever,
yeah.
that was
That's what I mean.
7th, 8th grade.
So,
Okay.
Yeah.
I agree with that.
I
Yeah.
think puberty. I think when
Yeah.
you, right after you go through or around puberty, you start noticing all stuff.
I mean, I noticed that women were different, and that was just interesting. That it wasn't anything like, or from the arousal. Because I remember in 6th grade, I always was the youngest kid in my class, based upon my parents adjusted kind of basically when I was a kid from Bangladesh, they kind of
skipped kindergarten.
they were able to get me in, as the youngest kid in the class, basically. So in 6th grade, I remember I wasn't really into girls yet. I was the youngest kid in my class. And so the 8th graders were asking me on the bus, so, hey, Mahin, do you like girls? I'm like, no, man. Ew. Girls are gross.
You're
and
like, no, man, ew.
and then they would yell there's a fag on the bus. There's a fag on the bus.
Oh my god. Oh my god.
Jeez.
What about you, Sim? We gotta get your.
So, okay, I would say around 7th grade, I started having feelings towards women, but
Women or girls?
girls. Well, we could
Let's
say
keep it
women.
straight.
I did have finer tastes back then, but no, listen. My mom always had a real close eye on this aspect,
Yeah.
and
She's probably the most forward-thinking
yeah, you know her,
immigrant.
Noreen.
Yeah.
She is someone who just reminds you over and over again that it would be like a little bubble. Every time you're talking to a girl, a bubble of my mom would pop up. You know those little comic bubbles right above your head? And she's like, Allah's watching, or, or don't talk to that girl, I'm watching, or you're going to get in trouble. So you would end up while I'm maintaining eye contact with the girl, I would end up looking away and remembering that my mom is going to find out somehow.
Oh, yeah.
So I think that continued all the way up into high school. And that's when in high school I'm like, wait, I can disobey her. And then you start figuring out, okay, well, this is when the internet first started coming out, right? So now all throughout junior high, I had no experience with women. And now all of a sudden I can talk to girls online. Mm-hmm. And
Oh yeah, the rise of
it started off with
AIM,
one, and
right?
then
Yep.
before you know it, it started off with 5 windows of girls you're talking to, and you're trying to figure out okay, which girl is the optimal girl to spend the most time with, because there's a lot of girls who just like the attention and they
Are
don't
these
want to
Muslim
go.
girls?
No, these are just any girls who will give you any attention. You know?
ASL, age, sex, location. Do you remember that?
Oh my god, yeah. So yeah, some were Muslim girls.
were Muslim girls.
Yeah, as I began to, so it was a process, right? As you realize, okay, well, how far? I was kind of a kid who kind of looked all the way to the end. What's the end result of this? And I always was looking towards marriage, right? So I'm like, okay, well, she's
Even
probably,
in 8th grade?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because my mom had built that into our heads. You cannot. And also in my mind, I rationalized it. I'm like, if I do this haram, it better be for a woman who's a 10 out of 10. There's no way
I'm not going to waste my sin on
I'm not
a
gonna,
dog.
Exactly, right? So I looked all the way to the end, and I'm like, okay, I realized, okay, I can't spend my time with a non-Muslim girl because I have to convert her, and it just takes too much time. So then I'm like, okay, all right, let's talk to Muslim girls. And then I started talking to Muslim girls in the area, let's just say. And this one girl tells me to call her, and I'm like, oh my god, this is the first time I'm supposed to call a girl. And I'm gonna have a conversation with her on the phone. And I pick up the phone, I call her. Her dad answers the phone.
Oh God.
And I get scared and I hang up. And I think I did say hello, and so he knew that was a guy. And I quickly hung up as I heard his voice, and I think not even a minute passes where he starts star 69's
Oh
us.
man, that was the worst invention ever.
And he ends up calling back, and I'm like, I'm hearing the phone ringing, and I know there's a phone right next to my parents' bed at night.
Oh God.
And I'm like, oh my god, what's this guy going to tell my dad about? So I closed the lights, turned off the computer, went to bed, and I hear my dad and this guy talking from his bedroom. He's like, my son would never call your daughter, blah, blah, blah.
Oh my God.
He would never call your daughter. he's not that kind of a kid. And that made me feel really embarrassed. But I think my dad knew that I did call her, but he was just...
He was covering for you. So do you think... So I'm curious. Do you think... Is that something that you think about with your children? Is that...
Oh, yeah, without a doubt. I mean,
do you want to do it the same way with your kids?
In terms of what?
Well, I mean, the one thing that I think about is... So I think a lot about how I want to parent a little bit different than my parents, right? So as I said, my parents were pretty fine with sort of mixed gender friends. I had guy friends or whatever, but there was still stuff that we didn't talk about, right?
Yeah.
Like we never talked about sex at all. When I was 25, this is funny. My dad loves the website Islamic City, right?
Oh, yeah.
So there was an article on that website about how to talk to your children about sex. Okay, it wasn't actually like about sex. It was just how to talk to your children about sex. So my dad emailed it to me and my brothers and my sisters, right? We're all like in our 20s. And the subject was about the birds and the bees. And that was like the extent of my sex talk, right? And so I was just like, God, that was irresponsible, right?
Yeah.
Like this is something that, and then until the day before my wedding, and my dad was like, okay, your mom is going to talk to you. I was like, she's not going to say anything to me, right? Like I was like, I'm 33, like I don't need to have a sex talk from my mom. But it wasn't something that we talked about. And that's problematic, I think,
Yeah.
right? I mean, they didn't pull me out of sex ed and stuff. So I went through all of that in school and that was fine. But I think that a responsible thing to do is talk to your children about.
Oh, I let
that.
Noreen handle all that, but I'm open to
With the
talking to them
girls.
about
I'm not going to handle it with their son.
Who's going to talk to our daughters, Sarah? You or me?
Oh, hopefully not you.
Not you, please,
Sarah.
God.
No, but why not, right? Shouldn't they feel
No, you don't know
like they
Mahin.
could...
No, you don't know him. He'll convince her to be a second wife by the end.
Oh, God.
Like it's something amazing to do.
We need to revive the sunnah here. And it's going to be you.
Well, other than outside of sex, I think what's most important right now that I feel about teaching our daughters is it's kind of like the men are from Mars, women are from Venus type of thing, except like try to explain to them how to weed out the creepsters and who's like considered a good person, like how to like weed out the weirdos and understand how men can be really creepy. I mean, I'm married and I still get those Facebook creepster
No, it's so
IMs,
weird.
like DMs or whatever they're called.
Wait, we guys do too as well. I get plenty of messages. I mean, a lot of guys get messages from girls who might not necessarily be girls, but they look like girls. Who want to...
I used to get IMs because Mahin is a feminine name.
Oh, yeah.
So I used
From
to always
guys?
from guys, mainly from Pakistan. Pakistani guys
Yeah.
off the boat in their late 90s, early
Okay.
2000s. Yeah.
But even, I mean, I think these conversations honestly are more important to have with guys too, right? Like there is just
How not to be a creepster.
how not to be a creepster and like all these sorts of issues that we see now with like, I don't know, consent and just being not gross.
Yeah,
right?
I had a guy in college like come up to me. We were taking a class together, non-Muslim, obviously, in Arkansas, and I was like, "Oh, you look really familiar. I think maybe I've seen you at a show or something." And we started like trying to figure out if we knew mutual people, and then he randomly, out of nowhere, he goes, "Are you a virgin?" I was like, was speechless. I
Yeah.
was like 16, 17. I was taking a college class. And I didn't know what to say. And I was like, I'm sorry. I don't think that's any of your business. I mean, where do guys come off like
Yeah.
thinking they can
Well,
talk
that's a
to?
sense of entitlement, right? So that's about raising
Yeah.
men to be gentlemen.
Yes.
Yes. and
Absolutely.
respectful.
It's just mind-boggling. I mean, I've had stalkers in college. And then, and I remember, so I had the stalker issue and a few stalker issues. And this is before I started wearing hijab and everything. So, I mean, yes,
Even with
I am
women
a
with
true
hijab
believer
also
that
have
wearing
stalkers.
hijab, I believed it protected me once
Oh.
I started wearing it. I mean, I did have
Yeah.
guys holler sometimes, but for the most part, I felt so much more protected. But before I wore hijab and I was in college and I was 16, 17, and I'd walk around campus and I'd have that one guy was one of them. He would follow me to different classes and another one would follow me in my car. I would be going like 55 and 35 zone trying to get away. And I had all these like weird, this one guy would write me poems about sowing his seeds. It was really disgusting.
Oh, God.
And slip it to me like in the library, like you'd find me and like I wrote you another poem. I was like, you can keep that. But anyway, so I remember telling my sister, because I was scared. I was a naive teenager. And she went to my dad because I was about to leave to go away for college. I was going to community college in high school. And she was like, Dad, you need to talk to, Noreen about this. She's got these. And he never talked to me about it.
Yeah.
And I
mean, that's part of it, right? So I think about that a lot, right? I sort of, there's an example from the sort of abstinence-only movement, right, amongst evangelical Christians. So they teach abstinence only, and they found that in that community, there's higher rates of teen pregnancy, right? And it's not that these kids are having more sex than other teens. It's that because they've been taught abstinence only, they haven't been taught like safe sex. So they're having more unprotected sex, which is leading to higher rates of teen pregnancy. And I think about that a lot with the Muslim community, right? So you can say these are things that we don't talk about, but the reality is kids are still experiencing those things. And Islamically, I feel like it's our duty to address reality, not what the ideal is, right? You teach your kids morals, you teach them what's right and wrong, but you also address the reality. And when there's a situation like that, for example, you want your child to feel comfortable to come to you and say, this is happening to me. I mean, I think that that's one of the things that's really important for parents, to sort of have those open lines of communication. And it's hard, right? I don't think it's easy to talk to your kids about some of these things, but when you think about their sort of physical and mental health and safety, I think it's imperative. I think it's irresponsible not to, honestly.
So I want to like ask Sim, like, you and Noreen got married pretty young.
Yeah.
So how'd you get in this picture?
So I think she was 19 and I was 20.
Well, we're 18 and 20 when we started
18
talking.
and 19.
No, you were still 20.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
were y'all both looking at the time, like, seriously to get married, or?
Yeah, I told my dad at about 17, I was like, I need to get engaged. Like, I am having a hard time focusing at school because I just need to know that I have somebody's out there for me. I mean, I just feeling so isolated in a small rural town and wanting to feel like a sense of community and that I belong. I think that self-identity you go through, that identity crisis, you want to belong to something. And so 17, I said that. Then I went to college, started getting spiritual, started hijab, praying, all that stuff. Went to an Alim program in Michigan that summer and was around Muslims, like, and there was guys and girls, and it felt good to be like in a big city and around a lot of Muslims and stuff. So then I started pushing more to my dad that I really want to get married. I was at this point 18. Went to ISNA, did the whole matrimonial booth.
How was that though?
What?
A lot of girls, they're really shy and they don't want to tell their dad that they want to get married. It seemed like it was pretty easy for you, or was it?
My relationship with my dad evolved over time. I think he started becoming more religious, and so we started having more open conversations about religious topics. And when I was in college, actually, I went away to college, but then I came back home because I told him, I said, I can't deal with all the drinking, the parties, my roommates having boyfriends, bringing guys, gay people, lesbians in my dorm hall, all this stuff that was like, all this like sinful stuff I was surrounded with. I was like, I can't deal with this stuff. I mean, I was open with him. I was like, this is what I'm dealing with and I need to come home. I need to create my own safe space for me to be able to practice my religion in the best way that I can. And it's really hard for me in this environment.
Where'd you go to college, by the way?
It's Hendrix College in Conway. And I think it's rated.
Sarah knows about it?
Yeah, I grew up in Mississippi, so...
you know about Hendrix?
I know about Hendrix.
I think it's rated like one of the highest
one of the-
colleges for homosexuality, too.
Is it Arkansas?
Yeah, are you going to pay a visit? Like, so
No, he wants to know about their football team and whether it's good or
there's no
not.
football
There's
team.
no
He's trying to compare.
It's like Benedictine University here.
Without
It's a
Muslims.
small-
But instead of Muslims, they have homosexuals.
Yes, I was only Muslim, only hijabi. I think there was one Shia guy and then me, but we didn't talk. And then, so it was felt just very isolated. But anyway, so I was able to talk to my dad about this stuff. So we went to ISNA, did the matrimonial booth, got this
at 18.
Wow. Got this like pamphlet of, bio datas, and that crossed out, who I lied to, I didn't like, whatever. But again, this was the time of AOL, Pal Talk, Fire Talk. There were all these like online chat groups, and that's where I was building like my Muslim community, because my outlet, because I didn't have anybody in Arkansas. And that's how, so one of my friends, her name was Gentle Muslima. She was the older woman, and she was like in her 50s. And I was friends with her in a chat group, and she said, I know this boy, he's Indian. I know you're Pakistani. Would your family be okay? Like, he's looking to get married. And I was like, yeah, my parents don't care if Indian, Pakistani, same thing, and as long as they're Muslim. And so then we started talking.
By the way, when she's Gentle Muslima is talking to her, I'm telling Gentle Muslima, this is totally not going to work out.
Who is Gentle Muslima? How did you know her?
Through another chat group. Remember? This goes back to the windows I'm talking about.
This is the year 2001. This is 2001.
So you guys met online.
I'm spitting game to 40-year-old divorcees. I'm trying to find out who's the best fit, basically.
Were you guys chasing anyone else before? Is there any serious talks with anybody before?
Oh, he had a couple. I
once went overseas to a European country to investigate, let's just say, and it didn't turn out well. Brokenhearted.
Yeah, I actually had one in England too. Yeah, these Islamic chat groups, and then this brother's like doing all this dawah, and I'm like, oh my god, you're so hot. You're doing all this dawah and converting people. So yeah, that didn't work out so well.
Yeah.
No, and I would tell my dad that that guy. I told my dad. My dad, asked me about his family situation. That guy's family situation was not. I think his parents are divorced. He had 10 siblings, and my dad was like, yeah, you're not going to a dysfunctional household.
Move
to another country and go to dysfunctional
this comes
home.
back to both of us. So again, both of us are kind of coming back to Islam at this point.
Yeah, I had a punk rock background,
and I had a heavy metal background. So she had a purple hair concerts.
You had purple hair?
Yeah.
And I had a leather jacket with spikes and chain and all that. So we had similar identities in terms of being people who are in subcultures that are, fringe subcultures somewhat, I guess.
Yeah.
Right?
Wearing hijab, I feel was my biggest act of punk rock rebellion against society. I'm not going to conform to your standards of beauty. And so in punk rock, their whole or part of their thinking is don't judge people for how they look. You judge them for who they are. And so that really, when I was studying about hijab, I was like, yeah, that totally makes sense to me. I can totally do this. I get it. So, yeah, so we kind of connected on that.
Yeah, basically, as soon as she said punk rock, I'm like, oh, thank God. See, I never liked girls who are just into...
Yeah, Backstreet Boys?
Yeah, the top 40 music that comes out, right? And that was always oh, man, I'm going to have to talk to one of these girls. It's just because it's just a mindset thing.
Yeah.
You have to be in punk rock or heavy metal to know what I'm talking about, because when you're part of those subcultures, you're it's us versus them, and it's always you're fighting against injustice, and you have a mindset of fighting oppression, and that was me. That was my childhood.
So when y'all came across each other the first time, was it? You said you were this is not going to work out, but then
no, that was me talking to our mutual
Muslim.
Yeah.
I'm like, no, Pakistanis don't like Indians, and it's probably never.
And she's from Arkansas,
Yeah, she's from Arkansas. It probably won't happen. You don't even waste your time on this.
So then I pulled a Khadija on him. I IM'd him first.
Oh yeah, she did.
I was like, hey, bro, what's going on? Wow.
And I think
I was like, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Oh man.
How are you, brother?
How long have you two been married?
16 years.
Wow.
Yeah. I remember talking to you about Danzig and the Ramones and
Yeah.
Green Day. Okay, so metal is different from punk rock, but there's like small overlaps that bands are kind of.
Well, my bands were more like Operation Ivy, Ramones was one.
So there were some things that we
The
could click
Clash.
on and like, okay, cool.
Yeah.
She gets me.
Yeah. And I understood his Metallica and
Yeah.
Megadeth and all that. So it was cool. But yeah, so we taught one day. Now I was like wise beyond my years. I was like, I don't care. I'm not going to waste my time with anybody. I'm going to pray Sakata. Like, I'm just leaving everything to Allah. I'm not going to waste my emotions and time on something that's not going to go anywhere. I thought I didn't have time to waste at 18.
I know.
So I prayed to Sakata that night, and I woke up and felt good about it. And then I told him, like, I remember calling, I was like, okay, I prayed to Sakata, everything's good. Now let me tell you, like, my dark secrets. I was like, now do you really like me? And he's like, yeah, you're cool. Like, it's fine. We've all, like made our mistakes, whatever. And then my dad came back. So we had come back from Pakistan and my grandfather had passed away. So my dad had gone back to Pakistan
Just
for
my
the funeral.
luck. Yeah. Right.
So he comes back like 3 days later, and I'm like, I have to tell my dad now. Like, I'm not going to let this go on without, I want my dad to know that I wasn't doing anything wrong Islamically, like I wasn't having conversations I shouldn't be having, whatever. So my dad comes back and I tell him, I'm like, yeah, Abu, I met this brother online. Some sister told me, and I prayed to Sakata and it was good. He goes, what? You prayed to Sakata without my permission? I go away for a week and you find yourself a husband? I was like, wait, chill out. I'm not married to him yet. Like, it would be fine. Just talk to him. So him and his mom, I think your dad was working in another state at the time. So him and his mom called my dad. And then
By the way, my mom, usually, a lot of people will be like, whoa, how was your mom on board with this? She was well conditioned with my previous endeavors into marriage, and by that time she's like, okay, he's gonna get married. So
he's determined.
Stubborn
about it.
My mom was. By the time I had, like, I think met you, there was probably 3 girls I had probably was involved with in terms of seriously considering for marriage.
And you were in college at the time, Sim?
Yeah.
Okay.
He was 20.
And your parents were cool with that? Like,
They weren't cool in the beginning. They were like, "What the hell are you doing?"
They were like, finish school first, and then eventually they were like, "Oh, well."
My mom was always excited about having the prospect of a daughter-in-law, so she would like answer their calls and she would like talk to them before handing the phone off to me.
I think my mom was like that too. Yeah.
Yeah. So she was always really excited about that. So by the time I met her, Noreen, she was like, "Cool, you finally tricked someone."
Yeah, probably.
And
so then my dad was like, okay, if you guys are serious, then come, if you show that you're serious about this. So they came. We first taught February 1st, March 3rd.
Oh God,
I got the dates.
And
they
he's
came.
a surgeon and whatnot. Yeah. We felt like the Beverly Hillbillies coming to this. I
Arkansas.
mean, it's not like we were like upper middle class, but I mean, his house was huge. It looked like the White House, and we were like, oh, great.
They had the Southern pillars.
My brother's like,
yeah.
My brother's like nudging me, like, what the hell did you do? Like, where are you bringing us to? And it's like Podunk, Arkansas. It looks like you're walking to the White House. And go ahead.
Yeah. So they came. My dad grilled him. Like, how are you going to support my daughter? My in-laws were like, don't worry, we got this. They'll live with us. We'll support them. So he grilled them, and then we made lunch and had lunch, and I was like hiding. Like, we're all sitting at a dining table, and I'm like hiding behind like my mom or something. And tried not to make eye contact. He was like sitting at the end. I was on the side. And then we went to have chai, and my dad was like, you guys can go have chai in the family room, and we'll be in the private, formal living room. But my dad sat and like...
Was this the first time you two were meeting in person? Wow.
Yes. So then we had chai, and had stupid conversation, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And just 10 minutes.
I was super nervous, and I remember holding the tea.
Yeah.
I'm holding the tea with the saucer. You know how you're supposed to, hold the saucer in your hand or leave it on the ground or leave it on the table? I'm holding the saucer in my left hand as I'm lifting up the tea all the way to my face. I'm like, what the hell?
I was like, what are you doing? Why are you doing that? Like, I was so mean. Being a bully.
Yeah.
Oh, you actually said that.
Yeah. I was like, why are you doing that?
I don't leave me alone.
But yeah, so then,
Did you have hair back then, by the way?
No.
And so
No.
you were cool with shaved head?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's fine.
Okay.
I think he was wearing a goofy anyway, but yeah, so they just flew in for 3 hours, flew back out, and then I didn't see him again till my wedding day.
Wow.
Or the day before my
Well,
wedding.
your dad came over.
And what
yeah,
was the
my
timeline
dad
for this?
my dad did come in like a month before the wedding and spent a weekend. So this was a whole 5-month process. So 4 months in, my dad spent a weekend in his house because he was like, I don't know anyone in Chicago that knows this family, so I need to check them out myself. So he came up, stayed in the house.
And my mom's an awesome cook, so he was really happy.
Yeah. So he met the whole family, did his interrogating again, got a feel for what kind of family I would possibly go into. Comes back, and he's like, "Oh, she cooked bagada bacon. She made, which is like some Indian dish. She made this fish with keema. She made halim. She made biryani. She made that. All my dad could talk about was the food, and I was like, "Okay, am I marrying the guy or not?" He was like, "Yes, you'll get married." So a month later, we were married in Dallas. And we had,
Okay, so this is what I find really interesting is that, so when you talk about these sort of parents, your parents and your parents are okay with their children getting married based on what? You know?
Well, based on like in terms of how are you talking about like our age?
No, I'm saying more that, I mean, now when you look back at it, right? Aren't you amazed that you got married
Oh yeah.
so
yeah.
young?
Yeah.
And like, alhamdulillah, it worked out, right? And you had a happy marriage.
Yeah, I mean there were
But-
definitely tough times though.
Right.
It wasn't easy at all. Like if my daughter came to me at 19 and told me the same thing that Noreen told her dad, I would be upset. I would be like, you know what? This is exactly what me and your mom went through, and through some of our tough years. This is what we went through. Like, are you ready for this? Because, this is quite the responsibility you're taking. It's not
Right.
something.
Yeah. And my dad wasn't completely on board. I was actually going to the imam who's his best friend and like appealing to him, like, please talk to my dad and to
Right.
explain to him this is a good guy, he's a good Muslim boy. In that hadith about when a good proposal comes to you from a righteous person,
Right.
you shouldn't deny it or something. I was like throwing all these hadiths at my dad, like.
Yeah. Hadith slinging.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, it wasn't easy for my dad because we were students, we were so young, but
Oh, I had to guarantee him that I'd finish college. Which I
yeah,
did.
he made him promise that. But yeah, so in his family, my mother-in-law was very insistent that they were going to support us, and they have, and they continue to support us even now.
Yeah.
Like, they help us out with the kids and stuff. So they're just awesome. I couldn't ask for better in-laws.
I will take that hint. When my daughter gets married, I am gonna like probably crash at that prospect's house for like a week.
That's a good idea, dude.
I was
Yeah.
like, that's how else you gonna know?
Yeah, my dad
what
doesn't
about
play.
what about you two?
So I'll go ahead and start first because I'm always the one initiating stuff, anyways. So, but basically, my whole background is like, so in high school, I've always been like that kind of guy. I don't have multiple crushes. I have like one crush for like 2-3 years at a time. You know what I mean? So high school, it was like some white chick from age 15 to like 18, right? And then I rebounded with this like random hijabi girl in our community. And that one lasted, and that one I told my mom about, and she was cool, but she's like, gotta finish school and all this stuff. But at the end of the day, I think they were looking for a doctor, and that never worked out. And then, then I got into, and the thing is, when I like kind of fell for this hijabi sister, I wasn't religious. It was like, so I was really weird. I was like, why do I like this religious girl when I have like, I'm a bad kid? you know. But I never did anything in that sense because I was afraid of my parents. So then all of a sudden I joined. I remember I was at Ohio State. I joined MSA. I was like, I'm gonna go to MSA meet girls. Show up there, and there was like there's no girls talking to any guys here. These some conservative brothers here with some beards down. They're like really long beards, but the pizza's pretty good, so I'm gonna stick around. So then through MSA, I met some people. And there's actually one girl. Actually, I had to tell Sarah this a couple of days ago. Like, yeah, by the way, before you, I actually proposed to a sister once. I just walked into her dad's office. I set an appointment and just said, they, you know, made the pitch. And Sim and I were talking, was like, you actually did that? I'm like, yeah, like that's how we do it in Columbus, Ohio. You know, we don't mess, like, I wouldn't PM the girl on the side. I would just.
Well, she didn't know about it?
No.
What?
She told, I mean, her dad went told her, but I didn't give her a heads up.
Oh, wow.
You know, 'cause I was like, I like this girl because I knew her from MSA, so I went and talked to her. She said, no, it is what it is. And then I remember another girl I knew from MSA, she made the Khadija style proposal to me. I'm at work, I had an email, I'm at an internship, and she hits me up and basically says, like, yeah, you know, she basically proposed marriage and was like, you know, I reached out to my dad about it. But at the time, I wasn't like, at the time, actually, I was thinking about that other girl still. I hadn't proposed yet. So I was like, no, I'm going to pass, but I appreciate, you know, I appreciated that because it made my job a lot easier when girls do that. Would you think? Like,
your hat size got a little bit bigger.
Yeah, I was happy, but I deleted the email. I was at that point in time, I was very cordial with how I handled like gender relations and stuff. I was MSA president. We had police, like, so if we saw guys talking to girls they shouldn't be talking to, we made sure brothers handled it.
Oh, yeah.
We were one of those, you know, MSAs.
God, you were that MSA.
Oh, we had that MSA too.
Oh,
Yeah,
come
so-
on, really?
So I was the president, and so I kind of like, so a lot of people, you know, whatever.
You had to hold up that Mitch.
Yeah. I actually deleted my Facebook account when I got elected. I was like, I can't have any.
Wow. That's seriously, huh?
Yeah, I was serious. I that's when I grew my beard out. You know, because a brother
You
was.
start rolling up your pants.
No, a brother told me when I got elected, election night, he was like, you are now like, you're a shepherd leading the flock.
Oh, my God.
You
Oh
know,
my
so I
Who
was like,
gave you this authority? Like, who in their right minds elected you?
I don't know.
You had to be in the late 90s. A lot of the young people listening right now, you will not understand the dynamics of MSA and how Muslims started forming their own like little societies in a lot of the universities.
I think it's still, I remember my sister went to Berkeley and she was saying after an MSA meeting, she got into an elevator and all the guys just stood outside. And she's like, seriously, you guys are not ride down in the elevator with me? And they didn't. And it's just like so strange. Would there ever be a second thought to like get in an elevator with a non-Muslim woman?
Right. I'll be frank. I joined like one of the perks of joining MSA e-board was that's the only way you could talk to a sister in MSA. Because if you were a general body member,
Yeah.
it wasn't happening.
I want to hear your story, but I want to talk about this because I think R.F. Chowdhury actually brings it up in his essay, and I think it's a really, really good point about the way that Muslim boys and girls don't interact and how that leads to very strange dynamics, particularly when it comes time for marriage age.
Right.
But talk about your story.
Yeah.
first, and then we'll
So
get back to
then
that.
I graduate. As soon as I graduate and get a job, my parents are like all 100% on board. So I remember one time and back then I used to be involved in Al Maghrib pretty heavily, Al Maghrib Institute, and they had these forums. So this Bengali auntie hits me up on PM, like just messages me through the forums and said, my friend's daughter, you know, they're looking for her daughter and stuff. And I was visiting Toronto, and this is right before I started my job here in Chicago. So then me and my cousin make a road trip out there, you know, and I'm like, I meet this girl 30 seconds and I'm like, this ain't happening. You know, and then I just like I'm like thinking up my exit strategy to make it like smooth. And that was like the only really like, I guess what we call a rishta, right? We don't, Bengalis, we don't use the rishta term. So anyways, going along, you know, I go home for Thanksgiving in November 2008 and my dad's got a stack of like CVs, like biodatas, right? And at the top of this, you know, list is this girl from Mississippi. And I look it up, it's like, it's Ida being in Mississippi, it's the middle of nowhere. And I was like, you know, I'm going to be bored down there. And Dad, you only like this girl because she's in medical school. And that's it. And, you know, all you're seeing is like dollar signs. And most likely she's a feminazi that's going to want to wear the pants in the house. That's what most female doctors are.
Yeah.
That's what I said to my dad pretty much. And he was like, no, this and that, and then the uncle who was friends with my dad and her dad actually calls the house, and I pick up, and he's making his pitch too. I'm like, yeah, whatever, dude. I listened to it and whatnot. So, a couple months later, my parents are like, hey, they're coming to Chicago. We're gonna come up and we want to meet them. And I was like, I'm busy that weekend. I got something going. I got like an Almogra class. I've taken it before, but I was like, I got an Almogra class to go to. And fine, I'll give you 2 hours. You got 2 hours. You can come up. So I told my parents came and everything, and they're making a pitch like, yeah, we talked to people, and they said this girl's so good, yada, yada, yada. I'm like, I'm not like really interested. And this is February 14th, 2009, right? So I end up...
Valentine's Day?
I bought a car that day, too.
Aww.
So I actually... And so we go to like the mutual friend.
They were late.
Oh, she remembers that detail right there.
Yeah, I remember because I bought a car that day because I wrecked my car a couple of months before. So we go up there. I told my mom ahead of time, this ain't gonna be one of those things like in The Godfather where you just sit across from each other and just look and just give a head nod and that's it. Like I'm gonna have to talk to this girl. You know what I mean? So it's like 2 hours and I'm just collecting. I'm like waiting. I'm looking at my watch. I'm like. They're just talking amongst themselves. She's sitting across from me. No one's like saying anything. Like the parents are talking. I'm bored out of my mind. And then finally, like I tell my mom, like, am I gonna talk to her or are we gonna leave? Like kind of deal. And then they all left and we talked for like 20 minutes and whatnot. And I was like, yeah, she's actually not bad. She wasn't what I, because she was talking about how like she's an OBGYN. That was her, I think, ambition and wanted to kind of go part-time, and she knew about Jerry Rice. My father-in-law was a professor at Mississippi Valley State, so I was like, and she knew about Jerry Rice, who was like, my favorite football player of all time, who went to school there. I was like, okay, this is kind of promising. I kind of like this girl.
That's so you. That's so you. Just figuring out based on the college football players. He's a huge college football fan. He's a huge college football fan, and it's just so him that he would find out that there's a famous football player who went to her school, and based on that,
the fact that she knew about him, I was like, okay,
it's a sign. What? It's a sign.
Well, yeah, whatever. So
they probably had a Jerry Rice statue outside that college, dude. He was like the only
Jerry Rice Field, right?
The stadium was.
Yeah. So we exchanged emails. We didn't really have to talk for like 20 minutes because I think we had to go or they had to go somewhere, and. We kind of went through this questionnaire over the next month or so. Like we'd schedule these phone calls. Like I think Sarah came up with the Imam Majid's 100 questionnaire thing that we went through, and just kind of talk about it. And we'd schedule an hour a week for 4 weeks, right? And then and every time I scheduled the call, I would copy her dad on the email, right?
Wow.
So how long did it take you guys to decide?
A month.
Wow.
A month? Okay. Yeah. It took us a week. We decided like in a week, right?
Well, I prayed to God of the night we talked.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Well, yeah. Well, that still doesn't mean that you're committed, right?
Yeah. I guess.
I think, we decided in a week and we're like, okay, you want to do this? Like, yeah, let's do it.
Wow.
I don't know. Like for me, I was like going through, it was promising, but at the very end, she told me she listened to music. I was like, it's one of those chicks.
Wow.
It's haram.
Okay, so I don't know if you know this, but Mahin was a hardcore Salafi back then.
Oh.
So a lot of our listeners will probably know this by now, but just so you understand.
I see.
So I think I told Sarah that's a red flag for me on the last phone call, but I'll think about it. That's kind of how I left it. We talked about pet peeves, but at the end of the day, I remember I bounced it off a friend of mine, and he was like, are you a moron? Like, you're gonna dump this girl because she listens and not even like growth, like, what I call like
Joe Bradford calls audible pornography.
Yeah, that kind of stuff. She listens to some Bengali songs.
Yeah.
And I was like, and I do listen to the Ohio State fight song, and that has instruments, so I can't really, be that kind of I'm kind of a hypocrite in that sense if I like completely do that. So everything else checked out fine. And to me, I had never met, like, I wasn't really used to, like, religious Bengali girls. So that was kind of like a cool thing where I grew up. So
I want to hear Sarah's perspective.
Go ahead. But long story short is I told my dad, go for it. And then I guess they said, but I want to, let's hear
Wait, so you guys, February 14th, and when did you get married?
June of 2009.
Okay, so a few months.
Yeah.
Kinda
3-4
us.
months.
Yeah.
So I guess all through high school, I was like so focused on studies. Like I have to say my high school was more rigorous than college. So I kind of really didn't have much time to think about much else. And we never really discussed marriage, my parents and I, except that, they would talk with their friends. They're like, yeah, we don't want her getting married until she at least has her college degree. So it was never really discussed until 2 weeks before I graduated from college. My dad brings up, so what are you going to do about marriage? I'm like, what? Out of the blue, out of nowhere. And so I think that was like the first time that we really sat down and talked about what did I want, et cetera, et cetera. And at that time, this was, 2 weeks before I graduated. I had already had my admission to go to medical school. And so my parents are like, yeah, I think, a doctor would be a good match. And I'm like, no, I don't want another doctor because, my schedule's going to be hectic and I want somebody who has more time flexibility. And then we also talked about, do you want a Bengali or, anyone from the subcontinent would do, whatnot. My parents are more open, I think, but I was kind of like, all our extended families in Bangladesh. So I think I would prefer somebody, from Bangladesh as well. And I think that was the extent of our conversation. And then after that, my parents, they started, I think they were getting, people inquiring before then, but they never brought it up to me. But after that, they started looking more seriously, I think. And by the time I was in my third year of medical school, I think they were getting kind of desperate. They're like, typical. Oh my gosh, she's about to turn 25. She's not married yet. It's good. She's going to be, single her whole life.
Right.
And it was right around, my parents decided to go to Hajj. They were putting it off, hoping to get me married before they left for Hajj. But at that time, they were like, okay, no, we're just going to go. We can't, put this off indefinitely. And right as they were, getting ready to leave for Hajj, this auntie calls my mom up about this guy, and he seemed like he was working in Chicago. He seems religious, et cetera, et cetera. So we get the biodata, and we kind of, seems okay. But then my parents left for Hajj and, we didn't follow up. And then after they got back, then kind of more serious. They're like, okay, should we investigate this further? What, pursue it. And so the next thing was like I had a rotation where I had some flexible time in February, so arranged to meet and then it was like a 2-hour meeting, but probably spoke face to face about half an hour, and then as I mentioned, we did the email thing once a week for 4 weeks. And then he didn't ask me directly.
Wait. You guys would send each other emails once a week?
No, just to schedule the calls.
Schedule the calls and then, and we'll talk about
cool.
once a week. Yeah.
Did you guys talk regularly, though, over instant messages or?
No, that's haram. She's not mahram still, dude.
Oh, my God.
Wow. Like, I didn't, email her.
Sorry, I'm sure you wouldn't have cared if he did, right?
I think, in a way, I was kind of... I appreciate that he was being so respectful. Yeah. And I know my parents were probably, impressed with that as well.
Yeah.
But, and I think I was at that point where, growing up, I wasn't really comfortable just being, having casual conversations with men, and so this was also easier for me. We had the scripted questions and I wrote down my answers and we'd email them back and forth, and some that were more complicated would discuss them during our telephone conversation, and after we went through the questionnaire, I'm like, okay, there doesn't seem to be any red flags here, so I guess pray istikhara and move forward, and that was it. And I think after we decided that we were going to get married, did we talk? Maybe again once.
Only logistics, somewhat, because I was like, I remember my aunt or my cousin was like, "Oh, you're engaged now? You must be talking all the time." I'm like, nope, not happening.
So the only other time we met, he came down to Mississippi, I think, a week before the wedding, so we could apply for the marriage license.
Wow.
And then
we had a pre-marriage counseling call with one of my father-in-law's colleagues, and I think other than that, just a logistical thing like, oh, by the way, where do you want to go on your honeymoon, kind of stuff. That's about it.
Yeah. Wow.
And Sim is like shocked because he's like, you're casual now. I'm like,
oh my gosh.
This is when you got charged per minute on cell phones. Yeah, my dad like wanted to kill me when he got my cell phone bill. Like,
I think
we had to pay him back.
Yeah, we talked all the time. Like, I think my cell phone bill was the first month we met each other. It was $400 or something.
Oh wow!
It was ridiculous.
Yeah.
And I told my mom, like, hey, Ma, I don't have this money, but I fooled her. You know.
Whatever.
Sarah, how old were you two then?
I would have been.
I was 25.
So I would have been 27, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
We were just young and stupid.
Yeah, it was funny because I remember I was at a restaurant with my buddy who you guys all know. I won't mention his name. He was texting his then fiance, and I was looking over. I'm like, man, come on, man. Like, y'all ain't married yet. Like, why you texting her?
Oh man.
Wow.
But now it's like, but it's funny because after I'm married, Sarah and I still don't text. She's not a texter. I'm a texter.
Oh.
So we never like text each other back and forth. It's like, unless it's like a grocery list or something like that or something.
That was actually something that came up when I was talking to my husband. It's like I would do these paragraph texts and he would write back, okay, or cool. And then I would get so irritated and we had a conversation about it. And then he wrote back. The next time I wrote a paragraph, he wrote cool and wrote an exclamation point. Like, this guy.
So are you like the extrovert in the relationship?
Oh yeah, we're total opposites. Actually, I was just saying to him yesterday, I was like, how did we get married? And it's interesting because I was 33. He's 5 years younger than me. But our personalities are very different. But I mean, alhamdulillah, it's working.
How did your parents deal with you marrying an African American?
They were totally okay with it. So actually, it's pretty interesting. So I grew up, like from a very early age, my parents said you just have to marry a Muslim. And I remember one of my friends saying, yeah, all parents say that. And then you bring home somebody that's not from your country and they're going to freak out. So when I first met David, I remember I called my brother and I said, my older brother, and I said, I met somebody. And he's like, okay, cool. And I was like, he's black. And my brother was like, okay.
And his name is David.
Well, that's interesting. I'll get to that point.
Okay.
But I said, yeah, he's black. And my brother's like, okay. So I was like, well, mom and dad said I could marry anybody that's Muslim, but what if they're secretly racist? And my brother's like, they're not secretly racist. And I was like, well, how do you know if it's a secret? And he's like, you don't have to listen to them. And I just remember being like, okay, my brother has my back. And they were fine. And alhamdulillah, it was really smooth. So his name is David, but he was born Muslim. He has an interesting family story. His mom's side of the family is Muslim. His dad's side is not. So his grandparents converted in the 60s. And then his mom's whole family was raised Muslim. And then his parents got married and his dad never converted, but the children were raised Muslim. So, yeah, he's third generation Muslim American, which is a pretty cool story. But the one thing his dad was like, he didn't like the name Dawood because he said people are going to call him Dawood. So he went with David. He had an uncle named David. So it was really funny because people always ask him like when he converted. He's like, one of these days I'm going to tell people Malcolm X's conversion story and see if they catch on. Like they used to call me Detroit Red and see what happens. But yeah.
You have a story in the book, Love,
I do.
Inshallah.
Yeah.
So talk to us a little bit about yours, because I want to jump at some of these stories real quick.
Yeah, let's do it. So my story in Love, Inshallah, is actually about the year that I spent working in Sri Lanka. And so I talk about it a lot, but, this issue of colorism, particularly within the South Asian community, and sort of this idea that, fair and lovely. So I grew up in a predominantly Desi and Arab community. We were Sri Lankan, and we had some Sri Lankan friends, but the majority of our friends were Indian and Pakistani and Arab. And so I think I just never was seen as a marriage prospect for anybody that we grew up with, right? Like I think people, when it comes to setting up young people, everyone kind of relies on their ethnic a racial ethnic community, and there wasn't a substantial Sri Lankan population where we lived. So I had some like proposals and stuff, but nothing really serious. So I never really had any kind of relationships particularly with South Asian men or anything. And then I went to Sri Lanka, and my story is about how my non-Muslim Sri Lankan personal trainer had a crush on me. So I talk a little bit about that. That's what my story is about.
Cool.
And it was a weird thing for me because he wasn't Muslim. He was a personal trainer. He was also a model. He was really good looking. And I was like, this guy likes me. Like, what is this all about?
Yeah.
So I was talking about that, and also talking about the idea of sort of feelings and attraction and desire and all these things that we don't associate with Muslim women, because often we sort of, Muslim women are seen as sort of asexual or desexualized. So that idea too, that these are all sort of natural feelings that we have.
How did you verify the stories? Well, first, before even verifying the stories, how did you get people to send you these stories?
Yeah, I mean, I'm still astonished. I feel like Salaam Love was a lot easier because Love Inshallah had come out already. But I mean, the women that contributed to the story.
Let's explain what the difference is.
So Love Inshallah is the book, Love Inshallah, The Secret Love Lives of American Muslim Women, which came out in 2012, and there's 25 stories. And then Salaam Love was the sequel. Salaam Love, it's American Muslim Men on Love, Sex, and Intimacy. There are 22 stories, and that came out in 2014. But Love Inshallah, we actually started collecting stories in 2008. So it took a long time for it to get to print. And this was really before Facebook or Twitter had taken off. So we solicited stories over email and just asking people, like there's one, Zahra Nurbak, she's the one that writes about going to the movies, The Birds, the Bees, and My Hole. That's her story. She did a one-woman show in San Francisco. Aisha and I went to the show.
Is she from Good Muslim, Bad Muslim podcast?
Yes.
That's her. Okay.
Yeah. She's one of the hosts. And Taz Ahmed, she's the other host who's also, they met through Love Inshallah.
Oh,
Does Taz have a story in there too?
Taz has a story in here too. She has a punk rock story, actually. Which
really?
Yeah.
That's crazy.
So, yeah, we would ask people to contribute. Aisha, my co-editor, had a blog for a long time, so she knew a lot of people who were writers in the community. So over the course of like 4 years, we collected about 200 stories, and then we whittled it down to the 25 that were in the book. But it was a lot. I mean, I think it was a lot to sort of tell people, hey, write about this very, very personal thing. And so I think the women were quite courageous to put their stories out there.
So isn't Zahra like bi and also married to an atheist?
Yes, she has an interesting story.
So what kind of pushback on us when you so like Sim was talking about in the beginning of the show that a lot of Muslims are so sensitive about like, not reality, but hey, we gotta promote a good face and not air our dirty laundry and stuff, and this doesn't represent Islam, etc., etc. Do what you want, but don't call it Islam or associate with Muslims. When you're dealing with that kind of story, what's your frame of thought as someone who's like practicing the deen?
I would say, so for Love Inshallah, as I mentioned before, we really wanted to create this idea of a big tent. So we said to contribute to Love Inshallah, you have to self-identify as a Muslim and you have to self-identify as American. And we're not going to sort of put our biases or preconceptions about what that means onto that. So it was all people who self-identified. And it was really interesting because we did get emails from people saying, I'm not a practicing Muslim, can I still contribute? And we said, well, do you consider yourself Muslim? They said, yes. So we said, you're welcome to contribute.
Here's the thing. A lot of people would say that, okay, a story like Mahin's wouldn't probably make it into your book because it's kind of, it's by the book.
No, we have stories. The first story that opens up Love Inshallah is the story Aisha Saeed. It was arranged through her parents. She was 19 or 20 years old. They met twice. They got married, engaged 6 weeks after. I mean, it was very it reminded me of your stories.
So just for the listener, it's not just a book of salacious stories.
No. It runs the gamut.
Because I know Mahin mentioned that someone was a bi or something in that
No, it
story.
runs the gamut from people who met through family. I mean, it really runs the gamut of the way that people meet, right? Through family, online, at college. There's a woman who meets her husband traveling through Brazil, which is like every woman's fantasy anyway, right? You mean like, but I mean, so there's all kinds of Actually, he's Brazilian. They met in Chile, but whatever.
Semantics.
Yes, semantics. The idea that you meet a dark, mysterious stranger,
Yes.
right? So, so it really runs. I mean, there's all kinds of stories. People meeting at the mosque and I don't know where else. Where
You got Arif's whole story about going to Bangladesh
yeah.
and trying to get married, and that whole deal, where a guy kind of, because he got married eventually, which the book doesn't have. Even your story, I don't know that it doesn't end in marriage.
It doesn't
right?
end in marriage, right?
Right, even though that's what happened. So with Arif, I remember, I remember when y'all had the event at U Chicago. I think he had just gotten married around
Yeah, it was around that time. I think.
So the book didn't have it, but that's what happens a lot of times. Like guys get older, and somebody had messaged me the other day and asked like, "Hey, so and so guy's talking to my sister. What do you think?" And my first question in my head was like, "Well, yeah, I met him a couple times. I don't like him because he said something bad about Ohio State, and he's like 35. Why is he not married?
Oh my God.
Why has he never been married? Like, you know what I mean? Like, what's the dude been doing? Because he's had a good job for like 10 some years.
Yeah.
But like that energy, that's kind of baggage. I know we talk about girls having that kind of baggage when they wait too long.
Yeah.
Like guys, the same thing. You're like 35,
I would worry
30.
about that if somebody approached my daughter or asked for my daughter's hand and he's well into his 30s or even approaching 40. Like, wait, my daughter's much younger than you, and
There's two concerns. Does he have history, or does his unit even work anymore? I mean, honestly.
wow.
Whoa.
Hey, your mom taught me that. So.
Oh my God, my mom's the best indicator.
Like, oh, it doesn't work. That's why he's not married yet.
Oh my goodness.
No, I mean,
and
look,
I think Arif talks he's very. I really appreciate his story. He's very frank, right? Like he talks about not being ready to get married, which I think a lot of people should not get married when they do, right? I don't think a lot of people are sort of emotionally ready. So they're ready physically, but emotionally, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm probably still not
everybody's
emotionally
married.
ready.
but I mean,
Yeah.
look, I know people can say that they're not ready, but they have to. Like biologically, their body's saying you have to procreate. Let's just say,
Isn't that more for guys? You think?
Yeah.
Like, I don't know. Like,
well,
We
it
have
doesn't matter.
biological clocks. Our biological clocks.
so you guys are okay. So I want to like we.
Your wife is an OBGYN, okay?
Right.
No, I'm saying like
There's
y'all are
coping mechanisms.
Right,
There's
y'all-
coping
right.
mechanisms, right? I think that, for me, I was very, very focused on school. I was focused on like traveling. I was doing all of these things. So I was not, I was like, this is not a priority for me, right? Marriage didn't become a priority for me until I turned 30 years old. And that's because I was doing other things. But I think, and the truth is, I think a lot of people are doing things outside of marriage, which, whatever you can say about that. But when it comes to getting married, I don't think that marriage is just about sex, right? So that's why it's sort of, I go back and forth, right? If you want to prevent zina, which is why people get married at like 19 or 20, that's true. But a lot of marriages don't last. Like, alhamdulillah, you guys' marriage lasts. But you hear about a lot of issues for young married couples. I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. But the stories here run the gamut.
Right.
So
I know as guys, like I meet guys in their early 20s that are like, man, I got to get married. And they sounded like, remember back in the day? You got married young, so you probably had friends that were still single.
Yeah.
You were like the one married guy. They were probably like, I got to
That
get
was really annoying.
Really?
Yeah, because all his friends would come over all the time.
That hasn't changed.
Well, it got better. Trust me. You think this is bad? It was a lot worse. It was weeknights. It was every night.
Yeah.
They were all. I said, you just wait. They're all going to get married, and who are you going to be stuck with? Little old me.
Yeah.
And sure enough, I'm loyal. I'm committed. I'm always here.
So, ladies, I like to ask you guys. So, when you got, because for a guy, I'll be on it, like, growing up, yeah, men we're like kind of like more, I guess we are looking for sex. And we're like, we want to be practicing Muslim. That's the only way to do it. What's your frame of mind when y'all are trying to get married? I know you talked about already, like, hey, this society, there's too much stuff going on around me. I got to get married when I'm like 18.
I think the the family dynamics that you have matters. So if you come from a nuclear family, a stable home, I think that makes a big difference. That's what I've seen. Like girls that live in stable homes, they have no problem waiting because they're like, I'm happy in my home. I have no reason. My parents were divorced. My mother had mental illness. I was in a very dysfunctional situation. I was looking for stability and looking for, I wanted to create my own stable home. And I needed to get out of the craziness that was happening in Arkansas. So I tell him, I'm like, you were from a big city, check, big Muslim community, check, and you were willing to get me the hell out of Arkansas, check. Yes, I love you, marry me. Like, that's pretty much.
So that myth is, like, you always hear that myth about girl from a small town and, like, I was your Texas. Is trying to, like, get out of, make it out somehow.
Yeah.
There's truth to that.
Yeah.
Sarah, what do you think? You're from a small town. Did you trying to get out?
No, I don't necessarily. I think for me, I'm an only child, and all my extended family is back in Bangladesh. So growing up, I was aware that my parents, they worry about me a lot. They're like, okay, what if she's in a situation where she doesn't have anyone to support her if extended family's not here. So that kind of led down the road, to me going to medical school, because if there's anything with a job security, it's with a medical degree.
Right.
And then also the realization that my parents are probably always going to worry about me, so I need to be strong for them. Or I can't do anything to really mess up because that's going to freak them out.
Yeah. That's a lot of pressure.
And so it really, and so it was kind of like a natural progression. I kind of had my life planned out. I was going to go to college and I was going to go to medical school. And then wherever down the line Allah had written for me to get married, it would happen. And I think my parents are probably freaked out more, at my not being married by 25 than I was. I was kind of like, it's okay. It'll happen when it happens. But I think probably around the time that I was getting ready to apply for residency, I had to decide, okay, where am I going to apply for residency? I can, search the entire country versus, what if I were to meet someone that I wanted to get married to, after I end up in residency in one corner of the country and this other person's in the other, that's going to totally mess up my schedule.
Did you do med school in Mississippi?
I did do medical school in Mississippi,
okay.
yeah. And so right around that, I feel like, my entire life, things just kind of clicked into place when they needed to.
Yeah.
Alhamdulillah. And I don't know if it's my parents' prayer or whatever, Mahin and I met right around my third year of medical school, so that by the time we decided we were getting married, that's around the time that I was getting my residency applications ready. So I kind of focused my applications in Chicago area.
Yeah.
And so I think for me, it was kind of like it was the right time. And I was looking for that, at that point, okay, once I get married, then I'm ready to have kids. And I was 25 at that time, so the realization did hit. My biological clock is ticking. Obviously, it's not the same when you're 30 or 35, but still, like, you notice how quickly time passes.
Yeah.
And so, alhamdulillah, I don't think I was looking for it. About how, like, Mahin and we decided to get married, it was never the chemistry, that you realize that this is the person. It's kind of like, okay, we seem to have similar outlooks on what we want, so maybe this will work. Let's give it a shot,
Yeah.
But
Do you ever wish that you went back and thought maybe you wish that you asked more questions from Mahin, maybe?
yes, I think growing up as an only child, I didn't know what questions I should be asking.
Right.
It's only when you're, like, sharing a house with someone, you find
yeah.
out. He asked me, what are your pet peeves? But being an only child, I never had to share my room with anyone. My parents were adults in the household. I didn't know, what was entailed in really, taking care of the house, etc. So all the things that I have since identified as pet peeves. I didn't know about
living
them at
with
that
the
time.
person is a whole other dynamic.
Yeah, I think like
for
how
sure.
like taking care of a house is something that I never thought about. I just watch too much like whatever happens in the movies and stuff. You go to movies, you make out, and you have babies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
basically you're in, that kind of thing. But like, did you have other suitors before me?
No, so after I graduated from college, at that point, my parents encouraged me, to really attend like the matrimonial banquets or to sign up for the online, the online, what it was, I forget the
Shadi.
names now, shadi.com,
That
yes.
was a big one.
And so I think there was there was one person really that we exchanged like 3 or 4 emails, and then my med school exams came up and I didn't reply for like 4 weeks. And then so when I did reply, he's like, yeah, I thought you were interested, so I'm talking to somebody else. I'm like, okay, whatever.
Yeah.
I think that was as far along
I
as
think
it
you're
got.
telling me about somebody you had their profile. You looked at the Zynga profile or something, and he had a bunch of like things where like, oh, these are all the girls that I'm into. You remember that?
Oh, that was like my parents had gotten a bio data from somebody, and like he had pictures with when they went back and looked like on Facebook or whatever, he had pictures with other women, or and so that was kind of like, okay, if he's like, that free mixing, then we're not gonna gel. Like I don't have that sort of a personality.
Right.
She did tell me I was the best looking guy she came across.
I did not.
Or your parents said it. Someone said it at the Risha. They
He
commented.
remembers that.
Yeah, I was like, now you're forgetting that. I'm not holding on to my I'm holding on to my wild card.
Through the dark days, he'll
I'll
hold on to
tell the
that.
listeners one thing. Mahin's hat size is 7.5, and it's been growing and growing ever since this podcast started. It's going to be probably at 8. They will not make an Ohio State Buckeye hat. that will
I
fit
bet
his
like the
hat.
listeners are probably like, this is Mahin's wife. This is like mind blown.
Yeah.
Like, so she's like very proper and like clean cut and everything. And I'm like the complete opposite. I want to get your guys' take. Some of y'all have read the books. At least partial. I told y'all I'd read it like within a couple days 3 years ago. Do y'all have any favorite stories?
Oh boy, there's definite stories that resonated with me. I'll put it that way, but I can't give you guys my favorite story yet because I haven't finished the book.
Yeah, I
so.
haven't finished the book, but I like the punk rock story. Definitely resonated with me. I found the lesbian story very just interesting,
Mm-hmm.
especially.
And there's 2 actually.
Okay, so I've probably only gone through the first one.
Yeah, the first one is comes 3 stories.
And I mean, just considering like where we are in our society right now, talking about homosexuality and stuff, and how Muslims feel. I think a couple articles just came out about American Muslims or liberal Muslims embracing homosexuality.
They said that American Muslims are more embracing of homosexuality than I think it was
Evangelical Christians.
evangelical
Yeah.
Christians.
So that was really interesting to read that story because I'm still trying to wrap my head around.
And I actually think I almost feel, I mean, this book came out in 2012, and I feel like in terms of sort of conversations about Islam and homosexuality, I think that conversation has really changed over the last 5 years. But I remember when the book came out, people were like, what? You have stories from lesbians in the book? And I think they were stories that we needed to include. And so there's 2 stories. One is Ife Okoye, who is Nigerian American, I think she was very involved with Al Maghrib for a while also. But I mean, she talks about meeting her partner in the mosque and her partner wearing like niqab. So they were both like very, very practicing Muslims. And then the other story is Najwa Soul, who is Iranian American, who identifies much more as, I think, as a secular Muslim. But her story is about coming out to her parents, who were practicing Muslims. And so I think even seeing that range sort of blows people's mind. And then the idea that they both identify as Muslim, and they, growing up, I remember people saying like, oh, you can't be gay and you can't be Muslim, like that. And I was always like, that doesn't even make sense. Like, you can be an alcoholic and you could be Muslim. You can be a drug addict and be Muslim. Like, you could be all of these things and be Muslim. Not that being a drug addict or alcoholic is the same as being gay. But I mean, from people's perspective,
the sin doesn't take you out
of the fold. Yeah.
Right. So that was something that I just remember being like, that doesn't make sense to me. So those stories I appreciate. And then in the men's version, we have two gay men who write about that as well.
Sarah, do you have any favorite stories?
I don't have a favorite, but I think something that resonated with me. One of the ladies mentioned, when she was involved with a man who was not Muslim and broke it to her father, and the father's like, I just want him to consider or learn about Islam. And I think that was something that really resonated with me. Raising kids in a non-Muslim society, you have to be prepared that down the line, my daughter may bring home somebody who's not Muslim, and you don't want to be that parent that's like absolutely not, and have her rebel and go through with the marriage, but rather we trust that if somebody seriously, openly studies Islam, they'll come to appreciate it, and so that was a point of view that I found really.
Yeah, that was insightful. Yeah, that was my co-editor Aisha's Matu story, and her husband did end up converting before they got married, and it was because, when the way that he actually writes a story in Salaam Love, so his story is in the book too. But
what's his name?
Randy Nason.
I'll look for that one.
Yeah, but the story, that he came to Islam on his own. It wasn't that he was forced to convert, but studying it was something that resonated with him.
And I feel like, that's the correct path. I feel like I hear so many stories of one person, whether it's the man or the woman, being kind of forced into Islam. And I felt like, that was really probably a more appropriate way to do it.
That's interesting. I actually, when I was in 7th, 8th grade, I guess, had a crush on a preacher's kid. And you're 12, 13, like, well, you're not doing anything crazy. But his dad was like Methodist or something, and he used to actually go to the mosque and learn about Islam, and like he would come into the school and like talk to me and be like, yeah, I know this, whatever. So I had this crush on this boy, and I used to tell him, like, well, you have to convert. You have to become Muslim. You need to learn. If we want to get married, you need to learn. And then he was like that rebellious preacher's kid, so he never, that never worked out. But that's really interesting. For us to have those conversations with our kids, if they're, meeting people who are, especially for girls, because we can't marry, we're not supposed to marry non-Muslims, right? So having those, making them feel that they can come to us and talk to us about a crush, and then how to navigate that. I never thought about that. I just felt like I couldn't tell my parents ever. They would kill me. So
how did you vet these stories? It's something I didn't think about. Sim and I were talking the other day. It was like, how do you know someone's not making it up just to make a good story? Because my favorite story, which I'll get to, has everything.
So most of the writers wrote under their real names. A couple wrote under pen names. And they had to sign a contract sort of verifying that everything they wrote about was true. So, it was really sort of honor system. And, the American Muslim community is not huge. And so I think for most of the writers, we're connected to them by at least 2 or 3 degrees of separation. So
that's what the crazy thing is that when you talk about your intimate details, especially in the non-immigrant Western Muslims, there's not that many of us to begin with. It's people who have been, who are just growing up or who are children of immigrants. It seems like everyone knows each other.
Yeah, you were saying that you're family friends with Arif.
Right.
And I know Arif because I was introduced to him through his sister, who's a friend of mine. It's just so many connections.
Sure. Right. So my favorite story, which I've been waiting for a almost 2 hours on to talk about is Maher Reham's Just One Kiss.
Yeah.
Because I remember when we were like planning for this podcast, I told you now I know he's used a pen name because his stuff is juicy. So this story has everything. This story has premarital oral sex with MSA kids, right? Then has a secret nikah, and then has an affair with a hijabi coworker.
Oh,
Have you heard?
I wish you all could see Mahin's face right now. I think this is the best.
so excited.
Right?
He's like, I can't believe this happened.
I've read this one online. Yes,
I want to put Sib on blast because I told him about the story. He's like, "That's hot." Because especially when like he talks about how he like the story is he seems like he's a Malaysian guy, right? Based upon his background, his parents are from Kuala Lumpur, and so he marries this convert, and he's like, I've been like staying chaste for all these years, like 20 years, technically only 10 years because you only hit puberty when you're like 12 or whatever.
He doesn't marry her right away.
He doesn't. So like they start their MSA. So she converts. She starts wearing hijab. Then there was some MSA event where they happen to be making out, and then they were like, their oral sex was going down, and then they went to the imam and they're like, yeah, we're about to like do zina straight up. So you got to give us a secret nikah because our parents won't approve of it. They'll let us get engaged, but until I'm in school. And so they went ahead and did that. And then he says over time, the relationship just kind of like, deteriorated. And then he meets this hijabi coworker who happens to be married to like a masjid board member. And she's going through her own marital issues and her marriage is pretty much falling apart. And so he talks about how he just like busts in her apartment, like pins her against the wall and like,
yeah.
I was like, because I think this for me, it's like when I was a kid, we didn't have cable television. My mom watched a lot of soap operas.
Yeah.
And so it brought back some good memories of Days of Our Lives and stuff like that. That was my mom's show.
What went through your mind when you first read that story, Nora?
So it's really interesting. I'm trying to remember how many words this is. I think it came out to about 5,000 words. But when he first sent us, the first version of this story was 20,000 words.
Wow.
So we really had to work with him because these were supposed to be, I think we had asked for 1,500 to 5,000 words as short stories. Like sort of spoke about the story, and he wrote to us that it was like very cathartic for him to put it all out on paper. So then we had to work with him to trim it down, and this was the final story. But one thing, I want to read you a section, and I think that this is sort of the key to his story. So he says his parents met in Kuala Lumpur, married, and moved to New York to study. That's where I was born and raised, among immigrants who brought their extremely conservative cultural understandings of Islam with them. They were terrified of their children becoming quote-unquote American, particularly given the country's loose views on sex. If a youth was caught talking to a girl, it was tantamount to having premarital sex. While I had strong sexual urges, I adhered to my community's beliefs, but I struggled. And so this is sort of what we were talking about at the very beginning, right? Like he grew up in this community that was extremely conservative when it came to sort of relationships between boys and girls. And he was taught that, even talking to a girl was a sin. And I think when you're reading the story, I think that becomes very clear, right? Like this sort of, you can sort of see the trajectory. And then he talks about being in the MSA, what we were talking about earlier, right? And like the MSA was very segregated, and the sort of relationships between the men and the women were strained, and then that led to sort of the secret marriage.
I think it was kind of like I would classify it as probably a more liberal, just because we wouldn't have had an event where there would have been like guys and girls like kind of sitting on a couch next to each other either. Right. You know what I mean? But the other thing I wanted to touch on was how he talks about respect and merit, like how Scarlett, that's the wife's name used. 6 years in, she decides to go to California on his vacation, and he's like, she doesn't even respect me. She's going on vacation, didn't tell me, using my money. So that means respect's at the door, and then the intimacy is gone, and I'm still craving it. And so therefore, that's the other thing. And that's something I've talked to a lot of, like some of my friends I know, specifically in a medical field, like guys who are physicians, they've always got like nurses coming out of them, and at home, they're kind of getting like they're just hitting a stone wall. And so they're dealing with that. And whether they're falling into like any haram stuff or not is, well, I don't know. But like that's another thing. Like, that he found an outlet and whatnot. And Sarah and I were talking I was briefing her on a story like last weekend, and I was like curious to know like if someone's doing this, because he came across as a practicing guy. I wonder where he was at with his like relationship with Allah when he was having the affair.
Yeah.
And also the sister who was wearing hijab, because she wasn't divorced yet, and they were, having relations outside of marriage. I was just curious. I don't know if when you're doing surveys and talking to these folks, if they're ever opening them up to that level, like how their spirituality is being affected in that sense.
I mean, I think, for this, spirituality and like religious, like sort of relationship with God, I think it's woven into all of the stories. And I remember not so much with Salaam love, but one of the things that people told us about Love Inshallah was they said as they were reading it, they felt the sort of the hope that the term Inshallah conveys, that sort of hope and like love of God. So that really imbued those stories. I don't know, Salaam love. It's interesting. I think that the men speak much more openly about physical contact than the women do, which I think it's partly because of gender, right? It's more acceptable for a man to say that he had physical intimacy than it is for a woman. And I also think that Love Inshallah sort of opened the door for these men to talk a little bit more about sort of physical aspect of relationships. But one of the things when you were talking, I was just thinking about Maher's story. So when he's talking about sort of the lack of respect and the problem in his marriage, he said, "For years I kept thinking, is marriage supposed to be like this? I sought advice from elders in the community, but no one gave me anything concrete. It was always, quote, marriage is a struggle, got to deal with it. It will get better. But when?" And that's sort of something that we were talking about too, right? Like, so there's an importance of talking about relationships and even in the context of marriage, right? And I have to say, so I got married at 33, like I said. Most of my close friends that I grew up with were all married. And then most of my close friends in San Francisco were married at the time too. And I really benefited from that. I think my marriage really benefited from that. We've been married for 5 years and there's normal challenges, but I just feel like our marriage has been made so much easier because we were aware of all these challenges going in. Like my friends were very, very blunt about, issues of money and sort of space, even having somebody in your space, all of these things. People were very, very frank with me. Before you had kids, people were like, protect your marriage. Kids like make things a lot more difficult. So there's this idea that we have to talk about relationships before people are married, but even after people are married, right? Like there's this sort of this weird cone of silence. Like people complain about their husbands maybe, but like really, do you know what the status is of your friends' marriages and their relationships? And people need help. So where can they get it from? And for me, this story was sort of emblematic of the lack of support a lot of people have, particularly young people, when they get married.
I feel like recently had just this year, 5 of my friends have gotten divorced. Mm-hmm. And we were at a gathering, and it was like majority of the girls in that group were divorced or had been divorced and remarried. And we were like, what is going on like in our community? And then we look at, I start reflecting on my own marriage, and I'm like, are we okay? Like, and people don't want to talk about why they got divorced. And then you're like, you want to know, like, well, what went wrong? Is the same thing that's wrong with yours wrong with mine? Like, I don't know what this phenomenon is that's going on in the Muslim community these days, but it seems like divorce is on the rise, and that's another side of it that we're not talking about.
Part 3 on the way for Nora.
There's some divorce stories in here. Yeah, but I think, it's been for a long time. The divorce rate in the American Muslim community has been over 50%.
I guess because now I'm in my 30s.
Over 50?
Yeah, I think.
Wow.
Yeah.
I think people now are, I'm hearing more about divorces in our age group, now, and it's blowing my mind.
Yeah, and it's for all the reasons that non-Muslims get divorced, right? Like there's infidelity, and there's alcohol abuse, and there's abuse, physical, mental, emotional. There's people growing apart. There's all those issues that go on in Muslim marriages, but it's, again, there's like this sort of this shame, like we can't talk about it. Like, we don't talk about it. Because you want to save face, and you don't want, and part of it is being sometimes in closed communities and people gossip, and you don't want to make your marriage fodder for gossip as well.
Right, absolutely.
And I mean, but that's the bad on the community, right? It's like if you have this community where people feel like they can't get help because other people are going to talk about them, then that's a problem.
Yeah. I think a lot of people wonder about like marriages like Mahin's and ours, is that we had such quote unquote traditional ways of getting married, and then like you only met once before you got married? And then twice, and then you were married.
The second time doesn't even count because that was like getting the marriage certificate.
Exactly. Same with us. So we met the one time when he came to propose, and then we met for the marriage license and I don't think we even saw each other on the first Mindy.
No.
But then, So, so people wonder like how we were able to, first of all, the wedding night. Right? People are like, how did you not like physically have a relationship and just get married? And
my American white coworkers, it's mind blowing to them, this whole process, and they're like, wait, she was the first one? What? Are you crazy? Like,
and
like,
you don't know what you're doing. The guy and the girl both don't know what the heck they're doing. And I've had some of my friends even say that they felt like they were getting raped on their wedding night. You know, 'cause the guy has no clue.
Do we have to like? Because I'm not gonna say when it happened because we have kids, but nothing happened on my wedding night. I went to bed because you know why? Because I had a bet with a buddy from high school.
What was the bet?
The bet was we went to his wedding, and the day after there's like this thing at his girl's house. It was a girl's wedding, girl in our community, right? So all the aunties are like asking her how it was the night after, and we're in the room. Like I think I was like kind of like napping, happened to be napping, but I heard it, and so I looked at my friends and I were like, yeah, it was gross, man. These aunties are up in her business. You know what? When we get married and they ask us, the uncles are going to ask us or someone's going to ask us, we're like, yeah, I just, went to sleep. And so and I remember that.
Or you could have just did whatever you had to do and just tell them, nothing happened.
No one ever asked me, actually, but I was like, I had to honor that bet.
So your bet was for nothing. Oh, my God.
But that's part of it, too, right? Like, there's... like the fact that there's people going into marriage that don't even know the basics of sex. That's
they don't know about foreplay.
Yeah.
They don't know,
There's no first base, second base, third base. You don't graduate, When you date in the American culture, you like kind of work it up to it.
Yeah.
Right?
And you know what?
Right.
Like, so this is really interesting because this is not the Islamic tradition, right? Like, we have hadiths about the Prophet talking about foreplay and talking about like making your wife orgasm and all of these things. Like, there's like hadith about that.
Yeah.
So this is not something that, I mean, this is not our tradition. Actually, there's a writer, Moja Kaf, who, she's Syrian American writer. She has written, I believe, about how the sort of European puritanical strain has come into the Muslim community through like colonialism and imperialism and stuff. But the idea is that these are not things that historically haven't been talked about. They have been talked about, but we now attach so much shame to this stuff. Where there's nothing shameful. Like, I mean, you guys are gonna love this term, but I mean, Islam in the context of marriage is very sex positive, right?
Yes.
Like, it's not just about procreation. It's about enjoyment, and it's about love and all of that stuff. So there shouldn't be this kind of, you shouldn't have people getting married and feeling like they're raped on their wedding night because they don't know what's going on.
Yeah.
So I think premarital counseling should include a good amount of sex ed.
Yeah.
So I have some friends that got married this year, and I told them, like, I don't know, like, they're getting premarital counseling. I was like, yeah, you got to make sure you got to seek out sex ed because you can screw some things up early on if you don't. And back to what Islam's like approach to it, Imam Suyuti has a book with like 800 sexual positions. Mm-hmm. I think we talked about it in our show with Kareem.
Right.
Right now, some of our conservative listeners are like, y'all are talking
You're
about
all off-
sex
you're
with
all off-
women in the room. This is
No,
not
oh, no.
appropriate.
We're off the manhaj. Clearly.
But I mean, these are some real issues as far as like, and then divorce. Back to divorce. I think, I think once you have, I've seen a lot of people get divorced when there's still no kids in the play, and I think kids are, in a sense, a good like I don't know. You guys had kids pretty early.
Yeah.
Like, would you say kids provide? Because at that point, you can't just think about yourselves. You got to think about like, hey, if I get divorced and my kids, are then going to be, left with a broken home.
Right.
Dad, they probably won't see dad a whole lot. And,
Yeah.
Some people say that there's a relationship with apostasy and divorced kids. I don't know if that's true or
I
not.
think our kids saved our marriage.
Yeah.
We were like little kids, like brother, sister, fighting all the time. Even though we were so, we clicked so well before we got married. We were like, oh, I love you. This is awesome. We're going to get married. We get married and all, living together changes everything. He left like drawers open, cabinets open, his towel would be, whatever. And all these things would like drive me nuts. And, so I was probably the nag. I was always upset about something. But look, I left my family. I left everything behind, came to a new place. All I knew was him. He was my safety net. And when he was gone with his friends or whatever, not with me, like he would go to work and come home and play video games, and then his friends would come over and all these things, and I was like, no, I was very clingy, I'll admit it. I was very clingy, and that we just didn't know how to manage that. And I think having kids like saved our marriage, because I was so determined not to ever get divorced, because I was a child of divorce. So like when I met the 9-year mark, my parents were married for 9 years. When I hit the 9-year mark, I was like, I made it. Like I made it 9 years. I'm golden now. And alhamdulillah, we've made it 16 years, and it hasn't been an easy road. We've totally had our ups and downs. We were students. We were working, going to school together. We were having babies at young ages, working school and 2 kids. It was not easy, but we had a lot of family support. His parents were.
Yeah.
And the other great thing, and just to give props to my in-laws, is I think a lot of in-laws take their son's side. My in-laws always took my side. So even if maybe I was in the wrong sometimes, but my mother-in-law made it a point to be like, when I would go and say, this is, we're fighting about this, whatever, she would take my side and say, you better straighten out. To Sim, she'd be like, you better straighten out. I'm not going to talk to you. If she's upset, I'm upset,
Yeah, I think that's the key. Both of your stories, I think that's the key, is to have families who are invested in your relationship. And it can be a blessing. It could be a curse, like in situations of abuse or some issues that, you have families there who are just like, work it out, But I do think that it's really important to have that family support. My mom's the same way. She always takes David's side on things.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Sarah, do you have any thoughts on why you stuck with me for 8 years?
But yeah, every listener out there wants to know, like, how the hell have you put up with this
She's
guy?
so lovely.
Well, I think me doing my residency the first 4 years definitely helped. We didn't see much of each other. And yeah, I think once you have kids, you're definitely invested.
Yeah.
And I think going, you never expected everything to be lovey-dovey and, 100%. Like, my parents had fights in front of me, and they got over it and whatnot. And so I think when we have fights, it probably affects Mahin more than it does me. I think I'm kind of like, yeah, it's normal to have fights and then, get over it.
Yeah.
But, and I think he's definitely the more sensitive, the way he speaks, you don't get the sense, but I think his feelings are probably hurt more easily than mine are.
Aw, he's a big softie.
No, I think I kind of alluded because, like, when you like grow up and you like, so I was talking about my past history with like girls that I've liked, and alhamdulillah, I'd never like had a girlfriend or dated or anything like that before. It was funny how Allah protected me. Like when I was open to doing whatever, I was worried about my dad just like the wrath of my dad, and I realized later that it was just a front. Like, he just had an image. He wasn't going to enforce anything. But then, and when I got into the dean, and I got to the dean like when I was like 19, 20. Then I was like trying to keep everything like 100% halal, you know, as we talked about earlier. But she's right about that in the sense that I think as a kid growing up, I would see my parents fight. My mom would end up crying, and I would always think about, are they going to get divorced? Yeah. It would enter my mind.
That was terrifying. Even though we're looking back on it, when we fight with our spouses now, we're like, oh my God, our kids must be terrified, but this is really a small little argument that we're having. But because you remember when you were in their shoes, you would be terrified about all these little fights that your parents would have.
Yeah.
And you'd be like, oh my God, this might be it. They're going to probably divorce. And even though it was, in their eyes, it was probably relatively a small issue. But I know what me and Noreen did when we were first married. For the first few years, at least, we had a rule that we wouldn't go to sleep mad at each other. And it would resolve it.
People always say that. And I'm like, I need to go to sleep. And then the next morning, I'm like, all right, I'm fine now.
Human beings are dynamic. So whatever works for your couple, these are just ideas. It might work for a couple, it might not. So it happened to work for us for a while. I know, until we just like, okay.
Now we're just so comfortable with each other. Yeah. I go to bed angry now.
Yeah.
I don't need to talk it out.
Yeah.
It's really interesting that you guys say this because I had my first, kid when I was 35. How old am I? 35. I just had my daughter when I was 36. So I'm like an older mother. And it's interesting because I feel like it's kids make things so much more difficult.
It did. It didn't. It wasn't easy.
Yeah.
But what I mean by stage our marriage is that if I didn't have a child to bond us together forever, I don't know if we would have made it. I mean,
the stakes are higher.
Yeah. We were like, we look back and laugh now at our crazy fights, but
they're all like brother-sister type fights.
Yeah.
They're just stupid brother-sister fights, like, because when
I would run out of the house without my hijab on like a crazy woman. And he'd be like, what are you doing? I'm like, I'm mad at you. I'm running away.
Your oldest looks like Sim, right? Would you say?
I don't know. Some people say she has a skin tone, but they say she looks like me.
Yeah, because like my older daughter looks like, so even if my wife like dumped me after my first daughter, she'd have to look at like my mini me forever. Because everyone says my daughter is like my mini me, my older one. The younger one is like probably more like my wife. So we're split there, But before we wrap, we're going on like about 2 hours. Nora, do you have any upcoming projects that you got going on, or what's next for you?
I am actually working on a novel, which inshallah will be done by the end of the summer. It's called What Will People Say? And it's about basically a young woman who's persuaded not to marry her college sweetheart, and now they've reconnected 7 years later. So it's based on a Jane Austen novel, Persuasion, and it's about a Pakistani family in California, and really talking about sort of the interplay of family and relationships and all the stuff that we've talked about today.
Interesting.
So inshallah, that should be done by the end of the summer. So it's been
awesome.
Really great conversation.
Yeah.
That's
the reality, though. That story is the reality. Like most people don't have like textbook engagements like Sarah and I, for example. And if they do, then everyone's got like the reality that it hits them at some point, right? That's why that's maybe why I think I loved the Mahir Raham story so much, because it was so crazy. It was like, it has everything, and I was like, I'm just gonna go back. Like that's the one story I remember. Like I read that book 3 years ago.
Yeah.
And to me, like, and that's why I think maybe that's why people like me as a host, because I'm a religious dude. But like, that story was dope. And
well,
there was like so much haram in it, but it was so sweet.
That's the one story that got excerpted before the book came out.
Yeah.
And I remember we got so many emails from people who were just like, why did you include that story? It's like so all the stereotypes of Muslim men. And we're like, look, first of all, it's a reality. It's his reality. It's his story. But it's also one of 22 stories, right? So that was part of it. There's a huge spectrum. And of course,
people want to focus in on what they want to focus in on. We have that same problem with some of our listeners who just they choose what they want to see, and they're hoping to hear that, and when reading that story in your book confirmed their suspicion about what your book would be about, and they've chosen to label the rest of your book the same way. I was like that. I feel like I was a person. If I'm going to be honest, I was one of those people who probably would have messaged you and said, like, you're corrupting the religion, and what you're up to no good, basically. Let's just be polite about it. But
But I think we had to remember
no,
that at the time of the Prophet Sallallahu, that they had prostitution, they had infidelity, they had these things going on even during this
Sahaba
time.
were not perfect,
and they were the
right?
best of the best ummah,
Right.
And they
But
still had these issues.
what did they have, though? They had like a community of Muslims and people of one culture really understanding each other.
Oh,
over
but
here,
come
we're,
on,
over here, we're a lot of us have our little own cliques of different. Like, even though we'll be Muslim, a lot of us will be like, okay, well, I'm an Indian Pakistani Muslim crew, and then they'll be like in their own little echo chambers, and that's it. And they will never understand other Muslims from a different background, right? So I think if we something that we want to do with this podcast is just go out of our comfort zone and try to learn a little bit more about each other, and try to realize that there's many different types of Muslims out there, and we have to understand each other before we can even tackle some of the larger issues in our Muslim community.
Very well said. Do you have a website for any of these?
Yes, www.loveinshallah.com, and we are on Facebook, Love Inshallah, and we're at Twitter at Love Inshallah.
All right. Jazakallah khair, Nura, for coming through.
Thanks for having me.
Also, Jazakallah for your husband. I guess he's watching the kids tonight.
Yes.
Yeah, so
daddy duty. Yes.
Yeah, and I would also thank our special guest, wives of TMM, Noreen and Sarah. I actually wasn't, like, Sim proposed this idea to me the other night, and I was like, I don't think Sarah might not be down with this. But I was surprised that she was jumped on board, and alhamdulillah, I think we had a good conversation.
That's awesome.
For our listeners out there, if you have any questions or comments, you can direct them to the madmumlukes@gmail.com. You can also follow us on Facebook, like us on Twitter. We're on Instagram. Give us a 5-star rating on iTunes. For our special guest, Nura Maznavi, I'm your host, Mahin Islam, and for my co-host, Sim, we are signing off for the Mad Mamluks. Assalamu alaikum.